Hey crew, this is just a quick video tutorial to talk you through the sports psychology lab report. I'll talk through the marking grid and then give you some examples or show you some examples from previous years so that you can get a feel for what the expectations of the report are and what it looks like. So first up in the report is the title and abstract. Title is meaning the title page, so you've got your cover page. Then after that you've got your abstract, which is the overall summary of the report. Usually write this last, write it at the end, and it's a sum up of everything that you've covered in your report. You could also call it the executive summary if you want. You want to get it as close to 150 words as possible. Then after that, there's three main sections to the report. So there's the introduction, where you're going to overview your three psychological concepts that you're going to talk about. And then there's the methods, so you're going to talk about how we conducted the experiments that we did in class, and then you're going to go into writing up the results from those experiments that we've done. And then the biggest section is the discussion, where you're going to take the results that we found from our experiments and then you're going to link it up and compare it to research that's out there in terms of maybe books that have talked about the topics that we're covering, or journal articles that have investigated the same sort of thing. You're going to talk about whether the results were congruent with the research, so if they were along the same lines and if they agree with it, or if they differed from it. So that's what you talk about in the discussion, is making sense of the results that you found from your experiments. And then the last two components of the report that you're graded on is your presentation, so formatting and spelling, grammar, all that kind of stuff, just making sure that you're adhering to the guidelines that are on that page. And then references as well, so APA 6th edition, making sure that you've got plenty of in-text references to support statements that are research driven wherever they are in your report. Then also having a final reference list at the end of your report. And then down the page a little bit, it gives you a summary of the marking allocation for each section in the report. So it gives you a good idea of where you need to focus more content. Easy to see that the discussion's the biggest part, so therefore you need the most content in there. This is the marking sheet that will be used when you're getting graded on your report. So it gives you an indication of how many marks are allocated to each section of the report, and that indicates how many points of information that you need to cover. So if we're looking at, say, the introduction, there's 20 marks allocated to that, so you want to have 20 points of information that are covering the different topics that you're talking about, and make sure that you've got that level of detail in there to ensure that you get all those marks. And then the same goes for each one of those sections. In terms of the overall contribution, presentations 5%, so there'll be 5 marks allocated to that, and then references will be 5 as well. And then if we scroll down to the next page, it gives you the marking rubric, so just another reference guide to look at when you're writing your report. You want to be aiming to achieve all of these things in the A range. This is your goal. If you feel like you're down in one of these lower areas in a certain component, then just think about what detail can you add in to bump up that level of detail to achieve the A range. Same with presentation as well, just going for checking the descriptions there and making sure that you're achieving that in order to get the best grade possible. This is an example of a previous student's work. It's not 100%, so don't take it as gold standard, but it gives you a feel for what the report looks like. So you got title page first. You could improve this by adding a photo to personalize it to your style. Then there's the executive summary or the abstract. This one's quite wordy. It's about 300 words, whereas the marking grid recommends 150. So try and make it as concise as possible and hit that. A section that's actually missing here that should be before the abstract is a table of contents. So directly after your title page, you should have a table of contents on the following page, and then your executive summary / abstract, and then carry on with your report from there. Generally, if an academic report is 10 pages or more, then you want to have a table of contents. But if it's under 10 pages, then you don't really need one. So you should have more than 10 pages for this report, so add a table of contents. After that, the next section is the introduction. So this is where you're going to be talking about the psychological concepts that you're covering, introducing the concepts in terms of using some references to describe the concept, and then highlight key theories that are related to that concept. So take this one, the students talked about motivation first, talking about what it is, and then also covering some different theories and different components of motivation, like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, attribution theory, what that is, self-determination theory, goal setting and how that's related to motivation. So that's the first concept that they've talked about. Then the next one is activation, so they've chosen to cover that secondary. Then the second theory that the students covered is activation, going through the same process as the first one, so describing what the concept is, using references to back that up, and talking about key components of that psychological concept. So with activation, how anxiety comes into it, and relating it to sport activities. So in your own way, describing what that theory means, or what that concept means. And then attention is the third example that the students used. So that's the 3 topics that they've chosen to cover in their assignment. That's all you really got to do for the introduction, is introduce the 3 psychological concepts that you're covering, using references to back that up and describe what's involved with those concepts. The next section is the results. This is where you're displaying the findings of your experiments. In this section, you don't want to go into explaining what the meaning of the results are. You just want to strictly display the results in whatever method is best. So for some data like this with a lot of variables, a table might be the best option, whereas different types of data a graph might be the better option, like here with basketball free throw attempts. When you got 3 different groups and their score, a graph is a nice way of just showing the differences between groups. So that's going to depend on the data that you're trying to present in terms of what method. So the student has just gone through and presented the findings from the experiments of each of the psychological concepts, with subheadings of each concept as you go through. An important thing with this section is to not just display graphs or tables all the way through. You'd also want to describe in text the findings. So the best way of writing up a results section is to have graphs or tables that are visually displaying your results, and then in text you want to also describe it, like the student's done here. And then moving through the report, the next section. The discussion is the section where you want to have the most detail in terms of the overall report. And the goal of this section is to talk about what you did, what findings you found, and then make sense of those findings. You can do that in terms of comparing and contrasting with other sources of information that are out there on the same topic. If you cover motivation, then you'd be looking at the study that we conducted and what other research has been out there that's similar. What did they find? How is it the same, or how does it differ to what we found? Also books, so they might talk about, if you look at the textbook, Foundations of Sports Psychology, they talk about these concepts. You look at what they're talking about, compare and contrast it to the findings, and is it along the same lines or does it conflict with them? And then you can also in this section talk about limitations. With the experiments that we conducted, were there any problems with the methodology or the sample size that we used? Could that be improved? Demonstrate some understanding of the research that we conducted, and how it could be improved or what could be done better in order to maybe increase the validity of the results or just the overall accuracy. So you're going to repeat that process for each of the psychological concepts that you chose to cover in the report. Go through and do that, and then the final thing is reference list. Hopefully you can pick up the problem with this reference list with the indenting. Should be on the second line, not the first line. Just make sure that you've got your reference list in alphabetical order, congruent with APA 6th edition. And then the last thing after that is the appendices, which you could add the structure of the sessions that we covered, or the experiments that we covered. Any worksheets that were involved might be a little bit different this year compared to previous years. So just use this as a guide for the kind of content that you can cover. Finally, I'll just scroll through one more example. I won't talk through this one too much, but I'll just scroll through and make a few comments, and you can pause the video if you want to look at it and read it in more detail. But this one, same sort of thing, cover page, executive summary. This one's a bit shorter and a bit more closer to what the marking grid's asking for in terms of word length. This one's good. It's got a table of contents, which the last one lacked. Then from there, the students talked about psychological profiling. So that session that we did in terms of psychological skills training and creating a profile of an athlete and their mental profile. Just talked about that and integrated theory into what that means. Also motivation and activation arousal are the topics that this student covered. It's just going through the same process of integrating references and explaining what those mean. Then the methodology, describing the experiments that were conducted and how they were done in terms of all the relevant details. Also for motivation, what was used there, and then activation and arousal. Following that is the results section, presenting all the findings from the experiments. Again, just the findings here, not going into any explanation around what the findings mean. Just strictly the findings here in whatever format is best for that data. And then following that is the discussion, so talking about each one of the components that were covered and making sense of it. This one's a bit short in terms of the discussion. It's quite brief. I'd recommend probably going with some more detail here. That's probably where the student would have lacked marks, is the discussion, because it doesn't reflect the amount of points that are allocated to that in the marking grid. Then they've got a conclusion, but then they've talked about their limitations here, so that's another option, is instead of talking about limitations and practical applications within the discussion, they've brought it in as other sections later on. So that's another way of doing it. That is good that they've still covered that information, just in a slightly different way. And then references to finish off with. This one's looking better than the last example in terms of the formatting of the references.